The way that Glass told the story hints at his own prejudices against both Southern Baptists and Southern Jews. An openly chain-smoking Southern Baptist missionary, Sibley's work did not consist of one-on-one confrontations with American Jews. The story sets up the Southern Jews for their own mockery. So the Jews in Glass's article have absolutely nothing to offer potential converts except suffering. Sometimes people are not telling the truth. Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the channel where we take a look at the history of American religion, and we're going back to the 1990s today to continue our discussion of Shalom Y'all by Stephen Glass. Glass was, of course, a journalist made famous in the 1990s for making up his stories entirely, or partially, depending on the situation. And if you've missed my earlier video contextualizing Stephen Glass himself and the lies that he told, then I suggest you watch that first. Check the description for a link to that video. Today, we're picking up with Shalom Y'all, that story that I introduced in the previous video about some Savannah Jews who launched a counter-evangelism campaign against a group of Southern Baptists. What we're going to do today is go over the claims that were true or sort of true and things that seem not to be true in the story that Glass wrote, because they do tell us a lot about American religion in the 90s and the way that people were thinking about things in the late 20th century. As a reminder, Glass opened the December 9th, 1996 article that appeared in the New Republic with an introduction to a character I believe was entirely made up. I have not definitively proven that, but I believe that he was, and I'll unpack why that is my opinion in this video. The man was named Jim Johansen, a chain-smoking Southern Baptist missionary who binge eats fried chicken as he drives around Georgia looking for Jews to convert. The opening lines say, "Every Sunday evening, after a long and trying day of missionary work here, Jim Johansen drives 300 miles to Atlanta, where he lives. Along the way, he applies himself to the regimen he has developed over the years to restore body and soul after a tough stint on the conversion trail." You may have heard that old adage, write what you know, which is directed at fiction writers in order to avoid writing about things they don't know about and therefore making their stories implausible. So even if people know that you made the story up, there's something called the willing suspension of disbelief, which means people are going to go along with you, but they'll only go along with you to the extent that your story is plausible. The fact that some people went along with this story, clearly a lot of people, he was not found out to be making up his stories based on this, or for a couple of years after this, suggests that a lot of people believed the things that he was saying, but to me, this is an entirely implausible story. And that's important to know, the way that our biases influence the media we consume. So you have to know about the places you write about and the people who are going to be in them, what groups they represent, in order for people to read it and think that you're telling the truth. Or telling an emotional truth, we'll say. Although I believe that Johansen wasn't real, Glass seems to have done some homework in order to make him more plausible. But that also signals to us a bit that something is a little askew here. Let's start with Savannah. It's actually 250 miles from Savannah to Atlanta, but that's not a big deal. The readers probably assumed he rounded up. Crispy Chick was a real chain restaurant at the time, and it was popular in Savannah. It has only a few locations now, but it was in Savannah in the 1990s, and this might suggest to readers who were familiar with Savannah that he knew the area. It would have been easy enough to mention another Southern fried chicken chain, KFC, Popeyes, something like that, but he chose one that was more regional to make it seem like he was more familiar with the area. I think personally, again, this is all my opinion. Similarly, Glass tells us that Johansen uses I-16 to commute. This is another regional reference. This is the primary route that people would take who lived in the area. So details like this give the story color and make it feel more real. And they make people believe that Glass knows what he's talking about, so they might question some of his other claims less. They might go along with him as he's describing a man throwing away his mashed potatoes and eating 10 drumsticks driving 300 miles, as if this were some sort of ritual. But I also want to call your attention to this phrase he uses, on the conversion trail, as if he views this as a campaign similar to politics. So on the campaign trail, the conversion trail. It's evident from this writing that Glass seems to view religion as a kind of a contest. It's a competition, not unlike people trying to compete for people's votes. 1996 was an election year, and people probably would have heard the phrase the campaign trail a lot, so referring to it as the conversion trail sort of suggests certain things to the reader. But Glass and I are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back. So after introducing us to Jim Johansen, Glass introduces ideas that are partially true and partially not true. He uses the same pattern of some accurate details and some inaccurate ones, all wrapped up into one.
8 years ago, Johansen retired from his job as a bookkeeper at a car dealership and turned his attention to God's work, converting the heathen to his Baptist faith. Every weekend for 3 years, he has traveled throughout Georgia looking for convertible souls. He has tried his hand at apostates of all stripes. Once he even took a shot at a family of Zoroastrians.
There's a lot to unpack here. First, Glass doesn't seem to have the strongest grasp on the vocabulary he's using. Heathen doesn't mean non-Christian. It means someone outside Western monotheism. Also, it's a pejorative term, so you really shouldn't be using it, but leaving that aside. Someone who doesn't acknowledge the God of Abraham, which is the God worshipped by Jews, Christians, and Muslims, would be called a heathen, as the term were used. If the term were used. Here, Glass may mean that Johansen started with the heathen and moved on to Jews, but he seems to be lumping Jews in with the heathen. I do want to emphasize, these is Glass's words, not mine. I would not use the word heathen in this sense, at least not unironically. You'll never hear me personally using this to describe the people we discuss on this channel. But by putting Johansen in this framework, it's also possible that Glass was trying to signal Johansen was uneducated and that Johansen might employ language like that. It's hard to say. But it's not in scare quotes or anything, so it seems to have been Glass's term. If you're reading someone using language like this, it's very charged. It's important to check yourself and figure out what they're trying to suggest to you, where they're trying to lead you. Question what's underneath these things. He then refers to apostates of all stripes, which is a more glaring vocabulary error. An apostate is someone who has renounced their religion. If anything, Johansen would be seeking to make apostates, not trying to get them to stay committed to their own religions. The Zoroastrians referred to presumably did not convert and therefore are not apostates. I think Zoroastrians may have been brought up because they would be unfamiliar to most Americans and therefore most exotic. Zoroastrianism is an ancient Iranian religion that focuses on the battle between the spirit of good and the spirit of evil. We do find it in the United States, but it's a pretty small minority of Americans, and most people who are reading this probably would not have any strong associations with the term Zoroastrian. There is something real in the next few lines, although poorly contextualized. Then in June, the Southern Baptist Convention, the executive body of the largest branch of American Protestantism, voted to proselytize among Jews, making national headlines. The resolution rejected the approach of other Christian denominations that had decided to seek a dialogue with Jews rather than trying to convert them. Breaking with this, the Baptists mounted the most aggressive effort to convert Southern Jews anybody can remember in years. The Southern Baptist Convention was indeed the largest Protestant denomination in the world. They had passed a resolution on Jewish evangelism at their annual convention meeting in June of 1996. The resolution number 10 on Jewish evangelism, suggested that something might be changing. Let's take a look at it now.
Whereas our evangelistic efforts have largely neglected the Jewish people, both at home and abroad. Whereas there has been an organized effort on the part of some either to deny that Jewish people need to come to their Messiah, Jesus, to be saved, or to claim, for whatever reason, that Christians have neither right nor obligation to proclaim the gospel to the Jewish people. Be it therefore resolved that we, the messengers of the Southern Baptist Convention, reaffirm that we are not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. Be it further resolved that we recommit ourselves to prayer, especially for the salvation of the Jewish people, as well as for the salvation of every kindred and tongue and people and nation. Be it finally resolved that we direct our energies and resources toward the proclamation of the gospel to the Jewish people.
As Glass noted, this attracted national headlines, but this was a surprise to the man who authored the resolution, Jim Sibley. At the time, Sibley was the only person appointed by the Southern Baptist Convention specifically as a missionary to American Jews, but he wasn't the first one. The position had been vacant for 8 years before he took it, but that was due to budgetary constraints, not religious opinion. Sibley's work did not consist of one-on-one confrontations with American Jews. Instead, his work primarily focused on getting other Southern Baptists to talk with Jews about their religion. However, within a broader context, Sibley should not have been surprised. In the 1990s, some Jewish groups like the Anti-Defamation League were accusing Southern Baptists of deceptive evangelism practices, partly as a result of their association with groups like Jews for Jesus and other Messianic Jewish organizations. These were evangelical Christians who were ethnically Jewish, but who argued that converting to Christianity did not mean losing one's Jewish identity. And Sibley was one of many Americans and many Southern Baptists who supported groups like this. Glass doesn't tell us any of that, but he tells us that Sibley refused to have his picture taken because he was receiving death threats. I have found no evidence of this whatsoever. I have not found any sources making those claims, any discussion of Sibley, any interview I've found with Sibley. He doesn't say anything about that, and there was nothing about him refusing to have his picture taken. There were also Baptists saying other things at the time. The Alliance of Baptists, which was a more liberal wing of Baptists in the South who had broken away from the Southern Baptist Convention, put out their own statement in 1995 repudiating evangelism among Jews. They said that theological stands that condemned Jews for not accepting Jesus had fueled the Holocaust. The Alliance of Baptists, like many others in the 20th century, called for interfaith dialogue rather than evangelism. But the Southern Baptist Convention did not want its members to answer that call. Glass doesn't unpack that. He doesn't mention it. Glass saying that Southern Baptists were rejecting the approach of other denominations is correct. But his claim that the Baptists mounted the most aggressive effort to convert Southern Jews that anybody can remember in years is at best hyperbole. In my view, the way that Glass told the story hints at his own prejudices against both Southern Baptists and Southern Jews. Maybe even his biases against religion itself. Glass himself grew up Jewish, but this doesn't mean that he could not have had negative associations with Jews and Judaism, or that he might not have absorbed negative stereotypes about Jewish people. So let's revisit this character he's introduced, Jim Johansen, the overweight, chain-smoking binge eater of fried chicken. So first of all, smoking is one of the things that Southern Baptists rooted out of their culture before it was cool to do it. Now, today, you go to restaurants, you go out in the world, people are not smoking for the most part. This is not something you see in restaurants, in airports, and those sorts of things. Public smoking bans weren't really so much a thing in the 1990s. People were still smoking. But Southern Baptists weren't so much smoking, or at least they weren't openly smoking. The Southern Baptist Convention passed its first anti-tobacco resolution in 1933. In 1937, the messengers of the Southern Baptist Convention took it a step further, condemning ministers who smoked as detracting from the gospel. Repeatedly, over the course of the 20th century, Southern Baptists passed resolutions condemning tobacco, urging for its effects to be studied, urging for advertising of cigarettes and other tobacco products to stop, and more. In 1984, they urged any Southern Baptists who were still engaged in the practice of growing tobacco to cease such agriculture. And they said that they shouldn't sell the land, but should keep it and farm something else so that that would prevent other people from potentially growing tobacco there. In many of these resolutions, tobacco and alcohol were presented together as equally harmful. Southern Baptists have historically been associated with a strong anti-drinking position. When they engage in the ritual most call communion, they call the Lord's Supper, they use grape juice. But they were equally against smoking by the 1990s. Now, this is not to say that Southern Baptists don't smoke. Many do, many did in the 1990s. But an openly chain-smoking Southern Baptist missionary is about as plausible as an openly alcoholic one, which is to say, not very plausible at all. Someone from within that culture would be very highly unlikely to engage in such a practice in front of a journalist when that was so heavily condemned within the Southern Baptist culture. In the story, Glass has Johansen say, "My doctor tells me this and that are not good for my health," which is contextualized as his addiction to cigarettes and fried chicken. "But at least my soul is cleaner," he says. So this, too, is an unlikely comment for a Southern Baptist to make. The idea of balancing one thing against another, saying they balance each other out somehow, morally isn't the way that Southern Baptists tend to think about things. They see more that, and would see more as one problematic element will corrupt the entire thing. So they are seeking full purity, not weighing things against each other. As this is written, it also suggests that a Southern Baptist might engage in religious activity in order to cleanse their souls, which is also not something that fits within Southern Baptist theology. In fact, just the opposite is intrinsic to Southern Baptist doctrine. People cannot purify themselves. They have to rely on God to do it. But by giving him these vices, in my opinion, what Glass is doing is presenting him as a hypocrite and comical and somebody not to be taken seriously. He is somebody who is irrelevant, really. Johansen wasn't making converts. He was just wearing himself out and doing harm to himself. Potentially he was doing harm to the world, but primarily this character is just a mess internally. This move to characterize a sort of right-wing person as overweight, uneducated, or whatever, hypocritical in various ways, was criticized when Taylor Swift did it in her video for You Need to Calm Down. Unlike her who's who of LGBTQ celebrity, the people who need to calm down here, the people holding protest signs against people who are gay or something, they are presented as somewhat illiterate. They can't spell. Their signs are misspelled, and they're overweight and unattractive. So in contrast to this, the LGBTQ people are beautiful and rich and living their best lives. Freeze magazine called this poor shaming. Others have noted the coding of the villains as hillbillies, Southern, and blue collar. And to some extent, that's what you're getting from the story that Glass was telling in 1996. These people are rural and unsophisticated. Johansen has unattractive qualities that read through just as vividly. So in this way, the story sets up the Southern Jews for their own mockery in Glass's tale. So just as Taylor Swift was criticized for making the threat to LGBTQ people seem silly and irrelevant, the same can be said of the way that Glass presented the threat that many Jews perceived from evangelicals at the time. Jews who are upset about Southern Baptists passing a resolution on Jewish evangelism are presented as silly and overly sensitive, as if they're getting angry over nothing. Because clearly this was a threat that nobody should take seriously. You've just got some guy chain-smoking, eating fried chicken, and going to die doing it, but who's not actually doing anything that would convert anyone. Glass then introduces a real person, Alan Bosson, the pastor of Southside Baptist Church. There was such a church in Savannah. There still is. It is part of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Bosson was pastor at the time. However, he's quoted in ways that don't quite ring true, i.e., even if they don't want to hear it, we have to tell them about Jesus, and they're going to hell, and we have to stop this. Now, I can't definitively say that Bosson didn't say this or wouldn't have said it, but it does seem a little off. It would be far more likely for someone in Bosson's position to say something along the lines of, even if they don't want to hear it, we have to keep telling others about Jesus, or without Jesus, we are all condemned to hell, and we need to work to prevent people from being condemned. These sorts of things where they lump themselves in together, or they say that, like, we have to do this thing regardless of who's happy, or, those kinds of things. It's not going to be as aggressive as Bosson presented it, and there are also theological reasons why that would be presented in that way. If you were to read quotes from Baptist ministers during this time about this subject, that's mostly the sort of thing that you would encounter. So instead, Bosson's words come across as something more like you would read in The Onion, slightly askew, but feeling like a commentary on something that's real. The Van Glass also includes some mostly factual information about Protestants in the 20th century and their approach to Jews. This is mixed with some not quite right information. Reinhold Niebuhr was a pastor from Detroit who took a job at Union Theological Seminary in 1928. Union Theological Seminary was right across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. So there he developed relationships with American Jews who were his counterparts teaching in a clerical training school. While Niebuhr was there, he gave an address to a joint group that included faculty from Union and from the Jewish Theological Seminary about evangelism among American Jews. He called for an end to Christian missionary activity among Jews. Still, something about Glass's presentation portraying Niebuhr as being motivated by pragmatism rather than ethics or morality makes it ring a bit hollow. This cheapens Niebuhr's convictions, which were rooted in concerns about the psychological harm that would befall Jews who were pressured to convert to Christianity. It was not just about it being difficult to convert Jews. And the next section, then again, in my opinion, was drawn probably exclusively from the imagination of Stephen Glass. He says that Southern Baptists in Savannah had launched a telemarketing campaign in which they called Jews whose last names began with C in order to invite them to a speech about the chosen people and Jesus, their Messiah. He says only 10 Jews came, so they launched another approach, instead inviting Jews whose last names start with S to a spiritual cultural fair. Only a few showed up to these events, he says, and nobody converted. Now, this is not to say that such activities have never taken place at any time. But I have not been able to find any other evidence that this ever happened in Savannah in the 1990s. The closest we might get to something like this is the revival meetings of the 1950s, when Messianic Jews would talk at revival meetings in the South among evangelicals about their Jewish identity. These evangelists were called Hebrew Christian, and they included Jacob Gartenhaus, who was a missionary to American Jews from the Southern Baptist Convention. They traveled the American South preaching to American evangelicals about the Jewish roots of Christianity. I have seen evidence that Jews tended to view these as deceptive and mostly ignored them. And the meetings really didn't convert anyone, so much as they inspired Southern evangelicals to view Jews as special and specially chosen by God. In any case, now upon my reading of it, Glass then turns to caricature for Southern Jews.
The city's small and suddenly beleaguered Jewish population decided to break with an anti-proselytizing tradition dating back millennia. 4 months ago, Savannah's Jews launched a Convert to Judaism counter-campaign against Savannah's Baptists.
Although it is the case that Jews have generally not attempted to convert other people, at least in the past couple thousand years, there have been exceptions and still are to some extent. This anti-conversion culture is something that arose out of historical circumstance. Jews living among Christians and Muslims, where they were in the minority, which is virtually everywhere they were living, were typically prohibited by law from engaging in any missionary activity. This began with Constantine, with a prohibition on Christians converting to Judaism in the year 329, and the Roman Empire continued to enact similar laws for some time after that. More recently, and perhaps within the memory of some of the readers that Glass had at the time, there was a movement among Reformed Jews in America to potentially make converts out of people who did not have their own religions, the sort of unchurched, unreached sort of people. Agnostics, atheists, that sort of thing. Reform leader Rabbi Alexander Schindler had really pushed for American Jews to start acting as missionaries again. In 1978, he said,
I believe that the time has come for the Reform movement and others, if they are so disposed, to launch a carefully conceived outreach program aimed at all Americans who are unchurched and who are seeking religious meaning. It would be easy to tiptoe here, to use obfuscatory language and be satisfied to hint at my purpose, but I will not. Unabashedly and urgently, I propose that we resume our vocation as champions of Judaism, that we move from passive acceptance to affirmative action.
We don't have time for a deep dive into what Schindler was proposing and the movement he attempted to launch, though that is a fascinating story for another time. But suffice it to say, for our purposes, that at the time, that Schindler and other Jews who did advocate for missionary work in America were not advocating for converting a specific religious group, especially not attempting to convert their Christian neighbors. They advocated that the targets be people who did not have any sort of religion at all. As a reminder, this is how Glass introduced us to Savannah's Jews.
Rabbi Bernie Elzer of Temple Mikveh Israel, America's third oldest synagogue, is the quarterback for this new offense. Wide-eyed and wide-mouthed, Elzer, who used to lead a New Jersey synagogue, is a blend of the North and South. Efficient hospitality. He rapidly greets all newcomers with a cheery "Shalom, y'all," inquires about their background, and introduces them to the group. Half Northern transplant, half native Savannians, they share a potluck dinner of bagels and fried chicken, rugelach, and cobbler.
I don't think that it's coincidental that the main Jewish character in Shalom Y'all is from New Jersey. Bernie Elzer, however, was not the rabbi of Temple Mikveh Israel, although the synagogue is real. According to the synagogue's website, at the time that Shalom Y'all would have come out, the rabbi of the synagogue was Arnold Mark Belzer. Belzer studied at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, so it is possible there was some mixture of North and South to be found there. That may have some element of truth in it. There is an implication, though, in the way that Glass presents it, that the Jews in the South that we're concerned with here were not fully Jewish somehow, that they weren't connected to Jewish culture. These Jews are not quite as Jewish as people would be in the Northeast. This reflects a stereotyping of American Jews as belonging to a specific regional subculture. As for the greeting, "Shalom, y'all," that we have this rabbi using to greet his congregation, it's not that uncommon among people who would normally say y'all. In fact, in my research for this video, I found an invitation to the Shalom Y'all Jewish Food Festival being held at Temple Mikveh Israel. But here Glass suggests that the blending of cultures, eating bagels and fried chicken, the blend of North and South, that this somehow also influenced their practice of Judaism and their connection to it. So in this case, the Jews in Savannah, not being fully as Jewish as other Jews, had been influenced by the religious competition kind of culture of Georgia and had decided to enter it, and therefore to go against what is a long-standing Jewish tradition and one that he presents as fundamental to the practice of Judaism to avoid trying to convert other people. The reference to Elzer as the quarterback for this new offensive is another way that he's presenting it as a competition and nothing really to be taken seriously, nothing that really has any deep meaning for people. This is just a game. This is two people competing against each other. It doesn't have any deeper meaning. I have not found any evidence that this congregation ever took out ads in the Savannah Morning News as part of a counter-evangelism campaign. But the implication that Glass has in the article is that being both Southern and Jewish is itself silly, and so therefore, of course, these Southern Jews would do silly things like taking out ads in the newspaper trying to get people to convert. Other Jews, the presumably more Jewish Jews who live in other places, would not do such things. The congregation that he presents and their reluctance to engage in the plan both reflects American Jews and doesn't. It both reflects the general attitudes they might have had and also maybe doesn't. They would not want insincere converts. Most will tell you that if you tried to convert to Judaism, you will be pushed away. That's fundamentally to test your resolve and your commitment. But the unnamed dour old man that we see here, who is quoted as saying, "I believe in truth in advertising," seems to have a negative view of Judaism. This may suggest that Glass had some uneasiness about his own religious background. So what's the ad going to say? That it takes a lot of studying to convert, and when you finally become Jewish, your kids will have no friends, and you'll be miserable? That's not going to work very well. So the Jews in Glass's article have absolutely nothing to offer potential converts except suffering. Jewish views on this are variable, but the presentation of Judaism as a burden and a cause for suffering is a harmful stereotype. It's not really surprising necessarily that it would be presented this way, since this is a recognizable, harmful cultural trope we can see presented in many things in American pop culture and comedy about Jews and Judaism. But this doesn't match what we might find among Jews in the 20th century who were proposing that they needed to engage in missionary work. Schindler, for example, had presented Judaism as offering something positive and valuable to potential converts.
I want to reach those seekers after truth who require a religion which tolerates, more than tolerates, encourages, all questions. I want especially to reach the rootless and the alienated who need warmth and comfort of a people known for its close family ties, a people of ancient and noble lineage. Do we really believe that one must be a madman to embrace Judaism? Let us shuck our insecurities. Let us recapture our self-esteem. Let us by all means demonstrate our confidence in the value of our faith. For we live in a time when millions of our fellow Americans are in search of meaning. Tragically, many of the seekers go astray, and some fall prey to cultic enslavement. Well, Judaism offers life, not death. It teaches free will, not the surrender of the body and soul to another human being. The Jew prays directly to God, not through an intermediary who stands between him and his God. Judaism is a religion of hope, not despair. Judaism insists that man and society are perfectible. Judaism has an enormous wealth of wisdom and experience to offer this troubled world, and we Jews ought to be proud to speak about it, to speak frankly and freely, with enthusiasm and with dignity.
And Schindler was certainly not the only American Jew who would have viewed Judaism as positive and having something to offer to Americans who might want to convert. It had something to offer people that might be of benefit to them. But Glass, in his presentation, suggests that he does not believe this. His fictional rabbi doesn't seem to have any motivation other than competition. So this presentation tends to mock and cheapen the convictions of everyone it purports to describe. Ultimately, it presents religion itself as negative and harmful for individual lives. Its characters are all suffering from their religious affiliations and the obligations associated with that, and they don't have any positive things to offer to anybody who might be interested in joining with them. Certainly, religion can be a negative. It has been in the past for many people, and I assume, unfortunately, that it will continue to be. But if you're going to present an argument, present one. Don't misrepresent people, put words in their mouths, misconstrue their intentions. Selectively choose the elements that support your narrative without acknowledging something that might not. As we see in this article, Glass failed to take religion seriously at all. And in doing so, he failed to tell the real story about what was going on with people in American religion in the 1990s. What I wanted to emphasize in bringing this up and making these videos about it is not simply that Glass presented a narrative that was not accurate. Although it's true, he did present a narrative that was not accurate. Or at least, in my opinion, it probably was not true. I think most of us would have that sense anyway if we read it. I hope so. Anyway, I think mostly we would. But what I want you to know is it's always important to question your sources. Believing a false story can influence how you view the real world and has real-world consequences. Believing anyone and taking what anyone says at face value can be harmful. That includes me. Please check my sources. See what you think. Argue with me. We can all learn together. If something seems too good to be true, it's too on the nose, it confirms too much of the way that you see things, the way that you think people are in that other group over there, it's a good idea to check yourself. It's a good idea to examine those ideas further. But if something seems to confirm your preconceptions too much, you might not question it that much. That's human nature. But we should always be asking questions and verifying things and looking out for whether the sources that we're using are honest and reputable. Sometimes people are not telling the truth, but I want to know what you think of this story. So please let me know in the comments. And if you want to see more about the history of American religion, you can always subscribe. I would love to see you here again. Again, thank you so much for making it all the way to the end. I am grateful to each and every one of those of you out there, my imaginary friends. So until next time, please stay well and stay curious. Bye-bye.
Coming soon on The Relighistorian.
What's interesting is that this has become such a popular story completely out of the context of its own time, and therefore completely out of the context of the messages that it was trying to send. I had started to realize that my favorite childhood story was a treatise on American religion. We might call this depression or burnout today. For many chronically ill people at this time, the medical and religious explanations given to them and the proposed responses that they were meant to employ simply weren't satisfactory. We would now view the treatment that Mitchell advocated as psychological torture. Many women developed a mistrust for mainstream medicine because the treatments that were given to them were harmful, and they began seeking out alternative therapies. She became the highest paid female author of her lifetime. Although her professional life was going well, her marriage was not. But it was generally understood that they were only married on paper.